Imagine lying still in complete darkness, soaked to the skin, unable to feel your feet. The ground beneath you is not ground, it is a cold paste of clay, rotting wood, and water that has not drained in weeks. The temperature has dropped below zero. You have been awake for 31 hours, and in 90 minutes, someone will shake your shoulder and tell you it is your turn to stand watch again. This was not a punishment. This was a Tuesday. For 4 years, between 1914 and 1918, and millions of men across the Western Front, the Eastern Front, and the Italian Alps were asked to do something the human body was not designed to do: survive the night in a hole in the earth, exposed to temperatures that kill, without reliable shelter, without consistent warmth, and without anything resembling sleep. Many of them managed, many of them did not. And the distance between survival and death had very little to do with enemy fire. We almost never ask the right question about trench warfare. We ask about the artillery, we ask about the gas, we ask about the charges across no man's land. But the quieter question, the one that consumed more men than the machine guns in certain sectors, is the one we almost never ask. How did they sleep? To understand what sleeping in a trench actually meant, we first need to understand what a trench was. And not in the abstract sense, as a line on a map or a symbol of industrial age warfare, but as a physical space that a human body had to inhabit for days, weeks, and sometimes months at a time. The Western Front at its full extent stretched approximately 700 kilometers from the Belgian coast near Newport in the north to the Swiss border in the south. Along this line, by late 1914, both sides had constructed a system of earthworks so extensive and so complex that it constituted, in effect, an underground city. There were frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, communication trenches connecting them all, and behind those, the supply lines, the dressing stations, and the billets. The total length of trench dug by the British Army alone, over the course of the war, has been estimated at over 25,000 miles. But a trench was not a shelter in any meaningful sense of the word. All floor was, in theory, lined with wooden. Floor was, in theory, lined with wooden duckboards to keep men's feet above the standing water. In practice, the duckboards rotted, sank, or were blown apart by shell fire. The water accumulated regardless. In the low-lying clay soils of Flanders, the region around Ypres and Passchendaele in Belgium, the water table sat just below the surface. Dig down 2 meters and you were not finding earth. You were finding mud. Dig down 3 and you were below the water table entirely. The trenches did not flood occasionally. They were flooded structurally by geography as a default condition of their existence. The winters on the Western Front were not exceptional by European standards. They were ordinary Northern European winters. Temperatures in January and February regularly dropped to minus 10 degrees Celsius in Belgium and northern France. In 1917, a particularly brutal winter drove temperatures below minus 20 in some sectors for extended periods. The Eastern Front, where German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian forces faced each other across the plains of Poland and Galicia, experienced temperatures that regularly reached minus 30. The Italian Front, old in the Alps above 2,000 meters, had its own category of cold entirely. None of this was unexpected. The commanders knew winter was coming. The armies had supply chains and logistics departments. There were blankets, greatcoats, and wool uniforms. There were rum rations and hot food services. What the planners had not accounted for, what no one had accounted for, because no war in modern history had demanded it, was the combination. Not cold alone, not wet alone, not exhaustion alone, but cold and wet and exhaustion simultaneously, sustained for not days but months, in a space so narrow that a man could not fully extend his arms without touching both walls. The human body can endure almost anything in isolation. It was the combination that killed. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas. This was not propaganda. It was the genuine expectation of military planners on both sides in August 1914, grounded in the logic of previous European conflicts. Wars of maneuver, if they believed, would produce decisive engagements within weeks. One side would break, the other would advance. An armistice would follow before the snows came. But the pattern broke in September. After the German advance into France was halted at the Battle of the Marne, both armies began to extend their flanks north and south in an attempt to outmaneuver each other. Neither succeeded. By October, they had run out of flank to turn. The line reached the sea, and there, making the cold mud of autumn 1914, both sides dug in. This was not the plan. There were no purpose-built winter accommodations. There were no established supply systems for long-term position warfare. The men who dug the first trenches in late 1914 brought with them the equipment of a short summer campaign. Wool tunics designed for parade grounds, single-layer blankets, standard-issue boots with leather soles that retained water like a sponge. November came. Then December. The ground froze. The water in the trenches froze and thawed and froze again. Men who had enlisted in August expecting to be home for harvest found themselves staring across 30 meters of no man's land into the darkness, their feet submerged in ice water, their hands too numb to feel the rifle they were holding. The war had created a situation that no army doctrine had prepared for. Millions of men living underground in winter, indefinitely, with no clear end in sight. Survival was now a problem that had to be engineered from scratch. Cold does not behave the same way in a trench as it does in open air. This distinction is critical to understanding what soldiers were actually fighting against every night. In the open, a human body loses heat primarily through wind exposure and radiation into the atmosphere. Movement generates warmth. A soldier marching generates enough metabolic heat to maintain core temperature even in sub-zero conditions. The armies of Napoleon and Wellington had fought in winter for centuries on the principle that moving men stayed warm. In a trench, movement was prohibited. Standing watch in a frontline trench meant absolute stillness. The parapet was chest high. A man's head and shoulders were exposed above it, looking into no man's land. To shift, to stamp the feet, to wave the arms, any of these could attract a sniper's attention. Men stood motionless in temperatures that demanded movement, and the cold climbed through them from the ground upward and from the air inward simultaneously. But the greater enemy was the wet. Water conducts heat away from the human body approximately 25 times faster than still air at the same temperature. A man standing in water at 4 degrees Celsius loses core body temperature at a rate that, in dry air, would require temperatures of roughly minus 25. The trenches of Flanders were not at minus 25. They were at 2 degrees, withstanding water to the knee. This was enough. The condition that resulted, a progressive, potentially fatal lowering of core body temperature without frostbite of the extremities, was not yet formally understood by medical science in 1914. Doctors recognized its symptoms: shivering that stopped, confusion, slowed heartbeat, the strange sensation of warmth that preceded unconsciousness. They did not have a name for the mechanism. They simply knew that men who sat still in cold water died from it, and men who did not move out of it quickly enough were carried out on stretchers. The number of non-combat cold casualties on the Western Front has never been precisely established. Records were inconsistently kept, and many deaths attributed to illness or exhaustion were in fact cases of hypothermia. But in specific sectors during the winters of 1916 to 17 and 1917 to 18, WWII's British Army medical records indicate that cold weather casualties, hypothermia, frostbite, and trench foot combined, exceeded combat casualties for periods of weeks at a time. They were not dying from German bullets, they were dying from January. A soldier's relationship with sleep in the frontline trenches was governed by a single immovable constraint. At dawn and at dusk, every man had to be awake and at the parapet, rifle in hand. These moments were called stand to. The logic was tactical. Dawn and dusk were the traditional attack hours, the moments when the transition between light and dark gave the attacker maximum advantage. Both sides knew this. Both sides therefore placed their entire frontline force on full alert at precisely these moments, every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of how many hours the men had been awake, regardless of everything. Stand to lasted approximately 30 minutes at dusk and 60 at dawn. The longer morning version reflecting the greater attack risk at first light. After stand to, a brief ritual called stand down allowed the men to disperse. Some cleaned weapons, some ate if food had arrived. The rest slept, or attempted to. The rotation system that emerged varied by army, by unit, and by sector. The British standard assigned each man to a 2-hour watch with 2 hours off, cycling through the night. The French operated on similar rotations. The Germans, they whose trench engineering was generally superior, managed somewhat longer off periods in sectors where their dugouts provided more insulation. 2 hours of sleep, not a full sleep cycle. A human sleep cycle requires approximately 90 minutes to complete its first pass through deep sleep and REM. 2 hours was barely enough to reach deep sleep before the hand was on the shoulder again. Over days and weeks, this produced a cumulative sleep debt that altered perception, slowed reaction time, eroded emotional regulation, and, critically, impaired the body's ability to maintain its own temperature. A sleep-deprived body thermoregulates poorly. The soldiers who were most exhausted were, for physiological reasons, also the most vulnerable to cold. The exhaustion and the cold reinforced each other in a downward spiral. Cold made sleep harder. Poor sleep made cold more dangerous. This cycle, compounding over weeks, produced men who moved as if underwater, who stared without seeing, who sometimes fell asleep standing at the parapet during stand-to, a punishable offense that the officers increasingly found impossible to enforce because the men could not help it. Their bodies were simply shutting down. By 1916, the British Army had formally adopted a rotation policy for frontline service. Units would spend between 4 and 8 days in the front trench, then rotate to support or reserve positions, then further back to rest billets. The policy acknowledged that continuous frontline exposure destroyed men not through combat, but through the accumulated biological cost of cold and sleeplessness. 4 to 8 days. Then, the next unit took their place in the mud. The uniform a British soldier wore into the trenches in 1914 was, by the standards of the era, a reasonably well-made piece of military equipment. It was not designed for months of static winter warfare in flooded clay soil. The standard issue consisted of a wool service tunic, wool trousers, wool puttees wrapped around the lower leg from ankle to knee, and leather ankle boots. Over this, in cold conditions, a soldier might add a wool greatcoat, heavy, long, and effective at trapping body heat when dry. The problem was that wool, when saturated, loses the majority of its insulating properties. A soaked greatcoat retained perhaps 20% of its dry warmth. It also gained weight. A water-saturated wool greatcoat weighed approximately 11 kilograms. Added to the rifle, ammunition, kit, and rations a frontline soldier already carried. The men were cold and slow and heavy. The improvisation that followed was not encouraged by the army. It was simply unstoppable. Soldiers stuffed newspapers inside their tunics. The paper layer created a trapped air barrier that functioned as crude insulation. They wrapped their legs in burlap sacking. They wore multiple pairs of socks layered over each other. Those who could obtain them wrapped their torsos in strips of blanket beneath the tunic. Sandbags, their fabric rough and their dimensions versatile, were repurposed as leg warmers, as ground covers, as makeshift hoods. The lice helped in a grim and inadvertent way. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis, were universal among frontline troops on all sides by 1915. There was no effective treatment in the field. Delousing stations existed in the rear, but men rotated back to the front before reinfestation could be prevented. Every soldier of every rank on every front carried lice. They lived in the seams of clothing and fed on blood at night, producing an incessant itching that further disrupted sleep. What no one initially understood was that the lice, collectively, generated measurable heat at the skin's surface. Now the biological activity of thousands of parasites feeding simultaneously produced warmth, not comfort, not relief, but a fractional thermal contribution that, at -10 degrees Celsius, was not entirely meaningless. Men cursed their lice and scratched their skin raw. The lice, indifferent, kept them marginally warmer. The single most significant cold prevention measure issued by the British Army was whale oil, not a miracle technology. Rendered blubber from cetaceans, supplied in large tins, or distributed at the section level. The instruction was specific and mandatory. Every soldier was to remove his boots and socks at least once every 24 hours and apply whale oil to his feet before replacing them. The oil created a water-resistant barrier on the skin surface that slowed the penetration of moisture and reduced direct cold conduction. Failure to apply it was not merely a health concern, it was a punishable military offense, subject to loss of pay or field punishment. Officers were responsible for inspecting their men's feet. The foot inspection became a daily ritual in functional units, an almost absurdly intimate act of command, an officer kneeling in the mud of a dugout to verify that each man's feet had been properly greased. The units that maintained the inspection rigorously had dramatically lower rates of trench foot. The units that allowed it to lapse had men losing feet to gangrene without a single enemy bullet having touched them. The dugout was, and in theory, the solution to everything. An excavated chamber cut into the rear wall of the trench, roofed with timber and earth, sealed from the wind, a shelter where men could sleep, eat, and exist, briefly, in something resembling human conditions. In practice, the quality of dugouts varied so dramatically by army, by sector, and by time in the war that the word itself described everything from a shallow scrape in the trench wall to an elaborate underground complex 30 feet below the surface. German dugouts were, by consistent account, superior. German military doctrine in the early phase of the war accepted that the line they held in 1914 might be held for an extended period and engineered accordingly. German frontline dugouts were often 6 to 8 meters deep, reinforced with concrete, equipped with wooden bunks and even rudimentary heating through small stoves vented through pipes. Captured German positions consistently surprised Allied soldiers with their apparent comfort: furniture, paintings on walls, stored food, sleeping arrangements that involved actual beds. British dugouts were shallower, less engineered, and colder. This was partly doctrinal. British command maintained, especially in the early war period, and that constructing permanent-looking shelters would suggest that the line was not about to advance, which conflicted with the official strategy. Men were not to make themselves too comfortable. They were supposed to be preparing to move forward, not to live underground indefinitely. The consequence of this doctrinal posture was that British soldiers spent 4 years sleeping in worse conditions than their enemies, not because of resource constraints, but because of ideological resistance to the idea that the war might last. A typical British dugout of the mid-war period measured perhaps 3 meters by 2, with a ceiling low enough that a man of average height could not stand upright. It housed 4 to 8 men, sleeping in rotation on wooden shelves or on the ground itself, wrapped in whatever they had. The temperature inside a dugout did not reach the temperature outside, but the improvement was modest, perhaps 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the ambient air. At -10 outside, the dugout offered +0. Not warm, just less fatal. The candles helped. Each man was issued a small supply of tallow candles, and a dugout with 4 candles burning collectively raised the temperature by another 2 to 3 degrees through combustion heat and radiated flame warmth. The candles were used for light, for heating tea tins, and for holding near frozen extremities until sensation returned, a procedure that was deeply painful and medically recommended simultaneously. At precisely 6 p.m. each day, or as close to it as the distribution system permitted, the rum ration arrived. It came in a ceramic jar marked SRD, which officially stood for Supply Reserve Depot. Unofficially, the soldiers had their own interpretations. The jar was passed from man to man in the trench, now each receiving his measure, 1/16 of a pint, less than a standard shot glass. This was not sufficient alcohol to create intoxication. It was not intended to. The rum ration served a specific physiological function. Alcohol causes peripheral vasodilation. The blood vessels near the skin surface expand briefly, delivering a surge of warm blood to the extremities. Hands and feet, numb by cold, pulsed with transient sensation. The effect lasted perhaps 20 minutes. But 20 minutes of feeling one's fingers, for a man who had not felt them in 6 hours, was significant. The rum ration was the single most anticipated event of the soldiers' day, not because it made men drunk, but because for 20 minutes it reminded their bodies that warmth was still biologically possible. Hot food operated on similar principles. The logistics of delivering hot food to a frontline trench were considerable. The food had to be prepared in field kitchens behind the lines, transferred to insulated containers called dixies, and carried forward through the communication trenches, often under shell fire, by carrying parties. By the time it arrived at the front, it was frequently lukewarm at best. But lukewarm food in a frozen trench was meaningful. The body's metabolic response to food intake generates heat, the thermic effect of eating. A meal of stew or porridge, even at 30 degrees Celsius rather than the intended 70, raised core body temperature measurably. The calories were fuel, the heat was a byproduct. And the act of eating, the ritual of it, the cup of tea that followed, the brief congregation of men around a shared tin, served psychological functions that the nutritional analysis could not capture. The shared body heat was the final and most primitive defense. In the coldest periods, men slept in pairs or in clusters, pressed together on the dugout floor or on a wooden shelf. It simply happened, as it had happened too. It simply happened, as it had happened to humans in cold places for 10,000 years before trenches existed. The body knows what the body needs. The soldiers, stripped of almost everything, were left with each other. The measures worked well enough, much of the time, to keep most men alive. Al was categorically different. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter of 1941 was the coldest winter in the history of the Eastern Front. The scale of cold failure was so great that the German army was forced to retreat. The winter was categorically different. The winter of 1914-15 saw Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces operating in temperatures that regularly reached -25 to -35 degrees Celsius across the Polish and Galician plains. The supply systems that could barely maintain thermal baseline in France were entirely inadequate here. Austro-Hungarian units, chronically undersupplied from the outset, recorded entire squads found frozen at their posts, not killed by shellfire or enemy action, but simply stopped in position by the cold. German accounts from the Eastern Front describe soldiers discovered the morning after a particularly cold night still standing at their observation posts, rifles in their hands, eyes open, frozen upright. On the Western Front, the failure was less dramatic and more systemic. On trench foot, the progressive destruction of foot tissue caused by sustained cold and wet, was the primary cold weather diagnosis. The condition begins with redness and swelling, progresses to numbness, and in severe cases advances to gangrene requiring amputation. The British Army recorded approximately 75,000 cases of trench foot during the war. The French Army, whose doctrine on foot care was initially less rigorous, recorded higher rates still. If the men who lost feet in Flanders had not been wounded by the enemy, they had simply stood in water for too long. The mental toll compounded everything. Sleep deprivation at the levels sustained by frontline soldiers produces neurological effects that are clinically indistinguishable from psychosis after sufficient duration. Hallucinations, paranoid ideation, inability to distinguish dream from waking. Men reported seeing figures in no man's land that were not there. Men fired at shadows. Men fell asleep in the middle of conversations and woke seconds later, unable to remember where they were. The medical category of shell shock, now understood as a complex of trauma and stress responses, almost certainly included a significant proportion of cases that were, in whole or in part, the neurological consequences of prolonged sleep deprivation. The two conditions shared symptoms. They shared causes. In a trench in January, and with the artillery on both sides active and 2 hours of sleep every 24, they were difficult to separate. When the war ended in November 1918, what it left behind was not only the dead, the 17 million military and civilian dead, the broken landscapes of Verdun and Passchendaele, the names carved into stone across every village in France and Belgium. It also left behind the survivors, and the survivors carried the trenches inside them. The men who came home from the Western Front were, as a statistical cohort, physiologically older than their chronological age. Rates of arthritis, lung disease, and cardiovascular problems were elevated among veterans in the years that followed. Sleep disorders, chronic insomnia, night terrors, the inability to sleep in confined or dark spaces, were documented in veterans' medical records for decades. These were not psychological symptoms in isolation. They were the biological residue of 4 years of systematic cold, wet, and deprivation. What the trench demanded of the human body, and what the human body gave, was a demonstration of something we rarely confront directly: the astonishing range of conditions under which the body will continue to function if given no alternative. It is a poor kind of credit. The fact that men survived does not mean the conditions were survivable in any reasonable sense. It means that the threshold for human endurance is further out than we wish it were. That it is possible to keep a man cold, wet, exhausted, and terrified for months, and he will keep standing. Not because the conditions are acceptable, because the alternative is to stop. The trench was a machine for discovering that threshold, and for pressing against it continuously, and for discarding the men who crossed it. What we inherit from this is not a clean lesson. It is a trade-off. We built our understanding of hypothermia medicine, of trauma psychology, of military logistics and welfare, of the minimum conditions the human body requires to function. We built all of this knowledge on the bodies of men who were used to discover its limits. The medicine that saves lives in mountain rescue and cold water emergencies today traces its clinical lineage, in part, to the frozen trenches of 1914 to 1918. The cost of that knowledge was paid in feet lost to gangrene, in minds lost to sleeplessness, in a generation of men who never slept easily again. There are still places in the world where soldiers sleep in frozen ground and wake before dawn to stand watch. The technology has improved, the doctrine has changed, the physiological problem has not. Cold does not negotiate with history. The body that stands in water loses heat at the same rate it did in Flanders in 1916. The sleep-deprived mind hallucinates at the same threshold. The rum ration has been replaced by chemical hand warmers and Gore-Tex. But the fundamental transaction remains. To survive the night in cold ground, the human body must be fed, covered, rested, and held. The soldiers in the trenches knew this without being told. They learned it in their hands and feet and the fog behind their eyes. And they built out of newspaper and whale oil and shared body heat and a jar of rum that arrived at 6 p.m., something that the textbooks would eventually codify and the militaries of the world would